A millionaire couldn't pay his way out of this nurse's revenge. Elijah Moore had everything money could buy. Designer suits that cost more than most people's cars. A penthouse overlooking the city. Bank accounts with numbers that made grown men weep with envy. But there was one thing his billions couldn't purchase. Peace of mind. Standing in the parking lot of Rosehill Care Center, he checked his Rolex for the third time in 2 minutes. The building before him looked tired. Beige brick walls that had seen better decades. Windows that needed more than just cleaning, and a sign with letters that had given up trying to stay straight. This wasn't his world. His world had marble floors and crystal chandeliers. His world smelled like expensive cologne and fresh leather, not whatever that was drifting from the entrance. The automatic doors wheezed open as he approached, like the building itself was sighing. The lobby hit him immediately, that unmistakable nursing home cocktail of disinfectant trying desperately to mask something sadder underneath. Boiled vegetables, old linoleum, time moving too slowly. The receptionist looked up with the kind of smile people wear when they're paid to be pleasant. Her name tag read Margaret, and her eyes said she'd seen 1,000 visitors come through those doors with the same expression Elijah wore now. Equal parts obligation and dread. "You must be here for Harold Moore," she said, already reaching for a visitor sticker. "Room 103. He's been asking about you." Elijah doubted that. Harold Moore, his father, barely remembered his own name most days. The Alzheimer's had been stealing pieces of him for years, taking memories like a thief in the night. First the recent stuff, then the important stuff, until all that remained were fragments of a man Elijah had never really known anyway. The hallway stretched before him like a gauntlet. Faded wallpaper with roses that had lost their color. Handrails polished smooth by countless desperate grips. And sounds, shuffling feet, distant television programs, the occasional call for help that might or might not be answered quickly. His Italian leather shoes announced his presence with each step. A quiet reminder of the world he came from. The world where problems could be solved with wire transfers and phone calls to the right people. Room 103 sat at the end of the hall, like a period at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to finish. He knocked. Waited. Knocked again. "Come in." The voice was thinner than he remembered. Friendlier, like it might blow away if someone opened a window too quickly. Harold Moore sat by the window, staring out at a view that consisted mainly of the parking lot and a dumpster that had seen better years. He was smaller now, not just thinner, but somehow compressed, as if gravity had decided to press a little harder on his shoulders. "Hey, Dad." Harold turned, and for a moment, Elijah saw something flicker behind those gray eyes. Recognition? Hope? Or just the polite confusion of a man trying to place a familiar stranger. Then Harold smiled, the kind of smile that belonged to someone much younger, much happier. "Elijah, my paper boy, right on time." The words hit like a slap. "No, Dad. I'm not. I'm your son." "Elijah, your son." But Harold was already looking around the room, searching. "Did you bring the comics today? I've been waiting all week for the funny pages." "That cat. What's his name?" "The orange one who hates Mondays." Elijah's jaw tightened. This was exactly why he avoided these visits. The confusion, the frustration, the reminder that the man who'd raised him, if you could call those distant, work-obsessed years raising, was disappearing one synapse at a time. He pulled out his phone. 2 texts waiting. His assistant wondering about the Tokyo merger. His accountant asking about the quarterly projections. The real world, demanding his attention. He was about to respond when he heard it, a clatter from somewhere behind him. Elijah turned just in time to see his father stumble backward, arms windmilling frantically. The old man's face showed pure surprise, like he'd been pushed by an invisible hand. Instinct kicked in. Elijah moved forward, arms outstretched, trying to catch him. But Harold was already falling, gravity claiming victory over fragile bones and failing balance. The old man hit the floor with a sound that made Elijah's chest tighten, not loud, but somehow final. Like something breaking that couldn't be fixed. Harold lay there, blinking up at the ceiling, that same innocent smile spreading across his face as if falling was just another adventure he'd decided to try. And that's when she appeared. The door burst open, and a woman in scrubs rushed in, mid-30s, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that had survived what looked like a very long shift. Her eyes swept the scene in an instant. Elijah standing over Harold, arms still frozen in their catching position, looking guilty as hell. What did you do? The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Sharp. Immediate. Damning. What? Nothing. I swear I was just. You pushed him. It wasn't a question. Her voice carried the certainty of someone who'd seen this story before. Adult children, impatient with aging parents. Frustration boiling over into something uglier. No. He fell. I was trying to catch him. She was already kneeling beside Harold, her hands gentle but efficient as she checked for injuries. Her name tag read Clara Santos, RN, but Elijah barely noticed. He was too busy watching those eyes, dark brown, almost black, and filled with something that made his stomach clench. Judgment. You're lucky he won't remember this, Clara said, helping Harold into a sitting position. But I will. Harold giggled, actually giggled, like he was watching the world's best comedy show. Did I win? He asked nobody in particular. Elijah raised his hands, a gesture that felt pathetic even as he made it. Look, I understand how this looks, but I didn't do anything wrong. He just fell. Clara stood slowly, and Elijah realized she was taller than he'd expected. Not physically. She was maybe 5'6", but she carried herself like someone who'd never learned to back down. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her ponytail was coming loose, and there was a coffee stain on her sleeve that suggested this wasn't her first crisis of the day. You expect me to believe that? Yes. She folded her arms across her chest, and Elijah felt like a defendant waiting for a verdict. The silence stretched between them, broken only by Harold humming something that might have been La Vida Loca or possibly a hymn. With Alzheimer's, you never could tell. Then come back tomorrow, Clara said finally. You can tell Mr. Harold you're sorry yourself. Elijah stared at her. I'm not apologizing for something I didn't do. Her expression didn't change, didn't soften, didn't even flicker. Then I guess I'll have to file a report. The threat hung between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross. Elijah knew what that meant. Police reports, investigations, lawyers asking uncomfortable questions. His name in the papers, connected to words like elder abuse and millionaire scandal. In his world, reputation was currency. And Clara Santos looked exactly like someone who understood the exchange rate. You're serious. Dead serious. Harold chose that moment to start singing. Off-key and enthusiastic. Something about blue skies and sunshine that belonged to a decade when songs were simpler and the world made more sense. Elijah looked at his father, then at Clara, then at the door that suddenly seemed very far away. Fine, he said. Tomorrow. Clara nodded once, sharp and final. Room 103. 10 a.m. Don't be late. As Elijah walked back down that endless hallway, he could feel her watching him. Those dark eyes burning holes in his expensive jacket, seeing right through the designer armor to something he'd spent years trying to hide. The automatic doors wheezed open, releasing him back into the world where his phone had service and his problems could be solved with money. But as he sat in his car, German engineering, hand-stitched leather, more technology than most people's homes, he realized something had changed. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Elijah Moore wasn't sure money was going to be enough. And somewhere behind those tired brick walls, Clara Santos was making notes in a file that had his name on it. Tomorrow couldn't come fast enough. Or maybe it was coming too fast. Either way, Elijah had the distinct feeling his life was about to get a lot more complicated. The next morning arrived gray and unwelcome, like a bill you'd forgotten was due. Elijah stood in his walk-in closet, a space larger than most people's bedrooms, holding a tie that cost more than some cars. Armani. Hand-sewn. The kind of detail that whispered wealth without shouting it. But as he looked at himself in the mirror, the tie felt like a noose. He'd barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Clara's face. Those accusatory eyes. That certainty in her voice when she'd assumed the worst about him. The worst part? He couldn't entirely blame her. Elijah Moore wasn't known for his patience. He'd built an empire by moving fast, cutting through obstacles, eliminating delays. People were usually problems to be solved or assets to be acquired. The idea of sitting still, of being gentle, of caring for someone who couldn't return the favor, it wasn't in his programming. But here he was, driving back to Rosehill Care Center at 9:47 a.m., wearing a watch that could fund the nursing home's operating budget for a month. The parking lot looked different in the morning light. Still tired, still forgotten, but somehow less threatening. A few visitors were making their way inside. Middle-aged children carrying flowers and guilt in equal measure. Margaret, the receptionist, smiled at him like they were old friends. Back so soon. Apparently. She handed him another visitor sticker, and Elijah noticed her fingernails were painted with tiny flowers. Someone who still believed in making small things beautiful, even in a place like this. The hallway seemed shorter today, maybe because he knew where he was going. Maybe because running away wasn't an option anymore. But before he could reach room 103, she appeared. Clara Santos, looking like she'd been waiting for him. Same scrubs, different ones. Actually, these were blue instead of green, but the effect was the same. Professional. Unimpressed. Ready for battle. You showed up. I said I would. She tilted her head slightly, studying him like he was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. Most people in your position would have sent a lawyer. Most people in my position don't get accused of assaulting their own father. Something flickered in her eyes. Not quite surprise, but close. Like maybe she'd expected him to come in swinging, all money and threats and righteous indignation. Follow me, she said instead. They walked side by side down the hallway, past rooms filled with lives in various stages of unwinding. Elijah caught glimpses through open doors, an old woman knitting something that might become a scarf, a man in a wheelchair staring at a television that wasn't turned on, two nurses sharing a quiet conversation over someone's chart. How long have you worked here? He asked, surprising himself with the question. 3 years. Clara's voice was neutral, professional. You? What do you mean? How long have you been visiting your father? The question hit like a physical blow. Because the answer was complicated. He'd been visiting for about 6 months, ever since the doctors said Harold's condition was getting worse. But those visits had been brief. Obligatory. Check-ins rather than conversations. Not long enough, he said finally. She glanced at him, and for just a moment, her expression softened. At least you're honest. They stopped outside a supply closet. Clara pulled out a tray, the kind they used for medications, with small cups and a tiny teapot that had seen better decades. Mr. Harold likes tea with his morning routine, she said, handing him the tray. 2 sugars, no cream. He's very particular about it. Elijah stared at the tray like it might explode. Are you serious? Do I look like someone who jokes about tea? She didn't. Clara Santos looked like someone who took everything seriously, from medication schedules to visitor protocols to making sure Millionaire sons learned proper beverage preparation. This is ridiculous, he muttered, but he took the tray anyway. Room 103 was exactly as he'd left it, except Harold was dressed now. A cardigan that had probably been fashionable in the Carter administration and pants that were clean but well worn. He was sitting in the same chair by the window, humming something that might have been Moon River or possibly Happy Birthday. Hey there, stranger. Harold's face lit up like Christmas morning. You're back. I was just telling the nurses about you. Elijah set the tray down carefully. What were you telling them? About how you bring me the newspapers every morning. Best paper boy in the neighborhood. Never missed a day, even in the snow. The words should have been frustrating. Another case of mistaken identity. Another reminder of his father's disappearing mind. But something in Harold's voice, pride, maybe, or genuine affection, made Elijah's chest tight. Here's your tea, he said, pouring carefully. 2 sugars, no cream. Just how you like it. Harold accepted the cup with both hands, pinky raised like he was having tea with the queen. His fingers shook slightly, and Elijah found himself leaning forward, ready to catch the cup if it fell. You're a good boy, Harold said, taking a careful sip. Your mother raised you right. Eleanor Moore had died when Elijah was 12. Cancer, quick and merciless, leaving behind a workaholic husband and a son who learned early that emotions were luxuries they couldn't afford. Yeah, Elijah said quietly. She did. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Harold hummed and sipped his tea. Elijah watched the parking lot through the window, noting which cars belonged to visitors and which belonged to staff. Clara's car, he guessed, was the blue Honda with the dent in the passenger door and the nurses do it with care bumper sticker. So, Harold said suddenly, what's new in the neighborhood? Elijah almost smiled. Nothing much. Same old stuff. Mrs. Patterson still complaining about her fence. There was no Mrs. Patterson. There had never been a Mrs. Patterson. But Harold was looking at him with such expectation, such hope for connection, that Elijah found himself nodding. Yeah, still at it. That woman. Harold shook his head in mock exasperation. Some people just like to complain. They talked for 20 minutes about neighbors who didn't exist and problems that had never happened. Harold told him about the weather. It was going to rain, mark his words, and asked about school. Elijah played along, said he was doing fine in math but struggling with history. It was the longest conversation they'd had in years. When Clara appeared in the doorway, Elijah felt something that might have been disappointment. The spell was breaking. Reality was seeping back in. "Time for Mr. Harold's physical therapy," she said gently. Harold looked confused for a moment, then brightened. "Physical therapy. I love physical therapy. Makes me feel like I could run a marathon." As Clara helped him to his feet, Harold turned back to Elijah. "Same time tomorrow, paperboy?" Elijah met Clara's eyes over his father's head. She was watching him carefully, waiting to see what he'd say. What kind of man he really was. "Yeah," Elijah said. "Same time tomorrow." Harold grinned and shuffled out of the room, Clara's steady hand on his elbow. But she paused at the doorway, looking back. That wasn't so hard, was it? What wasn't? Being kind. She left before he could respond, but her words hung in the air like incense. Being kind. Such a simple concept, but somehow it felt revolutionary. As Elijah walked back through the lobby, Margaret waved goodbye like he was part of the family now. "See you tomorrow. See you tomorrow." But as he sat in his car, engine running, air conditioning fighting the morning heat, Elijah realized something had shifted. The nursing home didn't feel quite as foreign anymore. The smells were still there, but they seemed less offensive. The sounds were still sad, but they felt more human. And Clara Santos, with her suspicious eyes and her stubborn chin and her absolute certainty that he could be better than he was. She felt like a challenge he wasn't sure he wanted to refuse. His phone buzzed. 3 missed calls from his assistant. The Tokyo deal needed his attention. The board meeting had been moved up. The world was spinning, and it needed Elijah more to make it stop. But for the first time in his adult life, he let the phone ring. Tomorrow was coming whether he was ready or not. And somehow, that felt like the most important appointment on his calendar. By the third visit, Elijah had developed a routine. Park in the same spot, third row, near the oak tree that provided just enough shade to keep his car from becoming an oven. Nod to Margaret, who had started greeting him by name. Walk down the hallway at a pace that suggested purpose rather than reluctance. But today felt different. Today, he'd brought something with him. The newspaper was tucked under his arm. Not the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times that usually occupied his mornings, but the local paper. Comics and crosswords and community news about bake sales and high school football games. Harold was waiting by the window, dressed in the same cardigan but with different pants, navy blue today instead of gray. His hair had been combed, and someone had helped him shave. He looked almost dapper, in a way that made Elijah wonder who his father had been before the disease started stealing pieces. Paperboy. Harold's face lit up like Elijah had just delivered Christmas morning. "Right on time. Got your paper right here," Elijah said, settling into what had become his chair. "Comics and everything." Harold's eyes went wide. "Really? You brought the funny pages." For the next hour, they read together. Harold couldn't follow the storylines anymore. The sequential nature of comic strips was beyond him now, but he laughed at the pictures. A cat chasing a mouse. A dog wearing a hat. Simple visual humor that transcended the need for memory or context. Elijah found himself laughing too. Not polite chuckles or business meeting courtesy laughs, but real laughter. The kind that started in his chest and worked its way up, surprising him with its warmth. "This cat," Harold said, pointing at Garfield with a finger that trembled slightly. "He reminds me of someone. Can't remember who." "Maybe you," Elijah suggested. "You always hated Mondays." Harold considered this seriously, like it was a profound philosophical statement. "Did I? Mondays aren't so bad here. Every day is pretty much the same." The comment should have been depressing. Instead, there was something almost peaceful about it. No deadlines. No pressure. No stocks rising and falling based on decisions made in boardrooms thousands of miles away. "What was I like?" Harold asked suddenly. Before I got confused." The question caught Elijah off guard. How do you explain someone to themselves? How do you summarize a life to the person who lived it but can no longer remember? "You were busy," Elijah said carefully. "You worked a lot. Was I a good father?" The words hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they wanted to cross. Elijah looked at his father, really looked at him. The gray hair that had once been dark brown. The hands that had once signed contracts and shaken deals and never had time for catch in the backyard. The eyes that were asking a question Elijah wasn't sure he knew how to answer. "You did your best," he said finally. Harold nodded, satisfied with this diplomatic truth. "That's all anyone can do, I suppose." They were interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Voices raised in concern, the rapid squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum, someone calling for help. Elijah stepped outside to see what was happening. A small crowd had gathered around room 107, staff members mostly, but a few residents in wheelchairs, their faces showing the kind of worry that came from living in a place where emergencies were part of the daily routine. Clara was in the middle of it all, calm in the way that only comes from years of practice. She was kneeling beside an elderly woman who was sitting on the floor, conscious but clearly shaken. "Mrs. Chun, can you tell me where it hurts?" Clara's voice was gentle but professional. "My hip," the woman whispered in accented English. I think I broke something." Elijah watched Clara work. Her hands were steady as she performed a quick assessment, her voice soothing as she explained what was happening to Mrs. Chun. She was completely focused, completely present, like nothing else in the world mattered except this one moment and this one person who needed help. It was beautiful, in a way Elijah had never associated with his own work. When he closed deals, it was about winning. When he solved problems, it was about profit. But Clara's work was about something else entirely. It was about care. "Can you help me lift her?" Clara asked, looking up at him suddenly. Elijah didn't hesitate. He knelt beside Mrs. Chun, supporting her weight as Clara and another nurse carefully transferred her to a wheelchair. The old woman's hand gripped his arm with surprising strength, and he found himself murmuring reassurances he didn't know he possessed. "You're okay. We've got you. Everything's going to be fine." As they wheeled Mrs. Chun toward the medical unit, she looked back at Elijah with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said in careful English. "You are very kind." Kind. That word again. After the excitement died down, Elijah found himself alone in the hallway with Clara. She was updating Mrs. Chen's chart, her handwriting quick and precise. "Does that happen often?" he asked. "Falls. Every few days. Hip fractures are common at this age." She didn't look up from her writing. "Most visitors don't stick around to help." "I'm not most visitors." She did look up then, studying his face like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "No, you're not." There was something in her voice, not quite approval, but maybe the beginning of it. Like she was seeing him differently than she had that first day. "Can I ask you something?" Elijah said. "Why did you become a nurse?" Clara capped her pen and slipped the chart into its holder. "Why does anyone become a nurse?" Bad pay, long hours, emotional exhaustion, and the occasional thank you from someone who'll forget your name tomorrow. "That doesn't really answer my question." She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, made her look younger and somehow more vulnerable. "My grandmother," she said. "She lived with us when I was growing up. Alzheimer's, like your father. I watched my mother take care of her for 6 years. Watched her lose pieces of herself, piece by piece. But I also watched my mother find pieces of herself she didn't know existed." They walked slowly down the hallway, past rooms filled with afternoon television and quiet conversations. "When my grandmother died," Clara continued, "she didn't remember my name. But she remembered how I made her feel. Safe, loved, important." Elijah felt something twist in his chest. "Is that enough?" "It has to be." They'd reached the end of the hallway, where a window looked out onto the small garden behind the building. It wasn't much, a few flower beds, some benches, a fountain that may or may not have been working. But it was peaceful. "My father asked me something today," Elijah said. "He wanted to know if he was a good father." "What did you tell him?" "That he did his best." Clara nodded. "That's kind of you." "It's not entirely true." She turned to face him fully. "Truth is complicated when someone can't remember it. He wasn't around much when I was a kid. Work was more important. Money was more important. Success was more important." The words came out in a rush, like they'd been waiting years to be spoken. "I used to think that's just how fathers were supposed to be. Distant, driven, too busy building empires to build relationships. And now," Elijah looked back toward room 103, where Harold was probably still reading the comics, finding joy in simple pictures and uncomplicated humor. "Now I think maybe I learned the wrong lessons." Clara was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, Her voice was softer than he'd ever heard it. It's not too late to learn new ones. As Elijah drove home that evening, her words echoed in his head. Not too late. But when he looked at his life, the empty penthouse, the business that ran itself, the relationships that were all transactions and no connection, he wondered if maybe it was. His phone buzzed with the usual demands. Emails about market fluctuations and merger opportunities and quarterly projections that needed his immediate attention. For the first time in his adult life, Elijah Moore turned his phone off. Some things, he was beginning to realize, were more important than money. The question was he brave enough to figure out what those things were? The call came at 6:47 a.m. Elijah was in his home gym, working through his morning routine. 40 minutes of cardiovascular efficiency followed by targeted strength training designed by a personal trainer who charged more per hour than most people made in a week. The phone's shrill ring cut through the carefully curated silence of his penthouse. He almost ignored it. His mornings were sacred, protected time when the world's demands couldn't touch him. But something made him answer. "Mr. Moore?" The voice was unfamiliar, professionally concerned. "This is Nancy Rodriguez from Rosehill Care Center. There's been an incident." Elijah's hand tightened on the phone. "What kind of incident?" "The power went out around midnight. The backup generator failed. We're dealing with multiple emergencies, and, well, your father has been asking for you." Harold had been asking for him. Not for the paper boy, not for some figment of his deteriorating memory, but for him. For Elijah. 20 minutes later, he was driving through the pre-dawn darkness, his usual morning routine abandoned like everything else that had seemed important just an hour ago. The nursing home looked different in the early morning light. Emergency vehicles lined the parking lot. Ambulances, a fire truck, police cars with their lights painting the building in alternating red and blue. Generators hummed loudly, temporary power lines snaking through windows like mechanical ivy. The lobby was chaos controlled by professionals who dealt with chaos for a living. Nancy Rodriguez met him at the door, a small woman with steel gray hair and the kind of calm that comes from seeing everything twice. "How bad?" he asked. "Could have been worse. The backup generator died completely. An electrical fire knocked out the main system. We've been running on portable generators and emergency power." She led him through the crowd of workers and anxious family members. "Some of our residents need constant power for their medical equipment. Others get confused when their routines are disrupted. And my father? He's been agitated. Keeps asking for his paperboy. Won't let anyone else near him." They made their way down the hallway, which looked like a disaster movie set. Emergency lighting cast everything in harsh shadows. Extension cords ran along the walls like thick snakes. The normal sounds of the nursing home, televisions, quiet conversations, the hum of machinery, had been replaced by the roar of generators and the urgent voices of people trying to restore order. Room 103 was lit by battery-powered lanterns. Harold sat in his chair by the window, but instead of his usual peaceful demeanor, he was rocking back and forth, muttering something under his breath. "Hey, Dad." Harold's head snapped up, and Elijah saw something he hadn't expected: relief. Pure, unfiltered relief. "There you are? I've been waiting all night. The lights went out, and everyone was running around, and I couldn't find you anywhere." Elijah sat down in his usual chair, noting how different everything felt in the emergency lighting. More intimate, somehow. More real. "I'm here now. I was scared," Harold said, and the admission broke something loose in Elijah's chest. "I couldn't remember where I was. Nothing looked right. But I knew if I waited, you'd come. You always come." The trust in his father's voice was devastating. Harold, who couldn't remember his own son's name most days, who lived in a constantly shifting reality where past and present blended like watercolors in the rain, had somehow held on to the certainty that Elijah would be there when he needed him. "I'm not going anywhere," Elijah said, and meant it. They sat together as dawn broke outside the window, painting the emergency vehicles in softer light. Harold's agitation gradually subsided, replaced by the quiet contentment that came from having his routine restored, his world made predictable again. But the nursing home around them remained in crisis. Elijah learned the scope of the problem gradually, through overheard conversations and careful questions. The electrical fire had been contained, but the damage was extensive. The backup generator, already old and unreliable, was completely destroyed. The main power grid connection wouldn't be restored for at least 24 hours. For healthy adults, a day without power was an inconvenience. For elderly residents with complex medical needs, it was potentially catastrophic. He found Clara in the main hallway, coordinating with paramedics about which residents needed to be transferred to the hospital. Her hair had escaped its usual ponytail, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she'd been awake all night. "How can I help?" he asked. She looked up from her clipboard, surprised. "You don't need to." "How can I help?" he repeated. For a moment, she studied his face like she was trying to determine if the offer was genuine. Whatever she saw must have convinced her. "Mrs. Patterson in 215 needs her oxygen concentrator moved to the room with the portable generator. Mr. Kim can't use the electric lift for his wheelchair. He'll need to be carried to physical therapy. And Mrs. Chun." She paused, consulting her notes. "Mrs. Chun is refusing to eat because her electric tea kettle doesn't work, and she says the water from the tap tastes wrong." Elijah nodded. "Consider it done." The next 6 hours were unlike anything in his previous experience. He carried oxygen tanks that were heavier than they looked. He helped lift residents who were lighter than they should have been. He sat with confused elderly people who couldn't understand why their familiar world had suddenly changed, offering comfort he didn't know he possessed. It was exhausting work. Physical labor combined with emotional demands that left him drained in ways that 12-hour board meetings never had. His expensive clothes were rumpled and stained. His hands were dirty. His back ached. He had never felt more useful in his life. Around noon, he found himself in the maintenance room with 2 electricians and a facilities manager, looking at the burned-out remains of the backup generator. The damage was worse than he'd expected, not just the generator itself, but the electrical infrastructure that supported it. "How long to fix this properly?" he asked. The head electrician, a weathered man named Pete who smelled like coffee and electrical tape, shook his head grimly. "This whole system needs to be replaced. The generator, the transfer switches, most of the emergency wiring. You're looking at 6 months minimum, maybe longer. What about temporary solutions? We can keep running portable generators, but that's not sustainable. Too expensive, too unreliable. And it doesn't solve the bigger problem, which is," Pete gestured around the room, "at infrastructure that clearly dated from several decades earlier. This whole place is held together with duct tape and prayer. The electrical system, the plumbing, the HVAC, it all needs updating. But that kind of renovation," he shrugged, "that's serious money. Serious money." Elijah almost smiled. Pete had no idea who he was talking to. That evening, as temporary power was finally restored and the emergency vehicles departed, Elijah sat with Harold in room 103. His father was calm now, reading the comics from yesterday's newspaper for the 3rd time and finding them just as funny as he had the first time. "You stayed," Harold said without looking up from the paper. "Yeah." Even when things got scary, Elijah looked at his father, really looked at him. The cardigan with the small hole near the left elbow. The reading glasses that were held together with tape. The gentle smile that had somehow survived everything the disease had taken away. "Yeah, Dad. I stayed." Harold nodded, satisfied. That's what family does. Family. Such a simple word. But Elijah realized he'd never really understood what it meant. He'd grown up thinking family was obligation. Duty. Something you endured rather than embraced. But sitting in that small room, surrounded by the lingering chaos of the day's crisis, he began to understand something different. Family wasn't about blood or legal obligations or shared DNA. Family was about showing up. And for the first time in his adult life, Elijah Moore had truly shown up. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Outside the window, the last of the emergency vehicles pulled away, leaving the nursing home quiet and dimly lit in the gathering dusk. Soon, the staff would go home to their own families, their own lives. But Elijah wasn't ready to leave yet. He found Clara in the break room, finally taking a moment to sit down. She had a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold hours ago and was staring at nothing with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd been running on adrenaline and caffeine for too long. "Rough day," he said, settling into the chair across from her. She looked up, seeming surprised to find him still there. "You're still here. So are you. I get paid to be here. Not for this. Not for staying 18 hours straight, making sure everyone was okay." Clara shrugged, but he could see the exhaustion in the gesture. "It's what we do." "It's what you do," he corrected. Most people would have done the minimum and gone home. She studied his face in the fluorescent light of the break room. You didn't go home either. No, he said. I didn't. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who'd survived something together. The crisis was over, but its effects lingered, in the temporary generators still humming outside, in the scattered equipment that would need to be reorganized, in the knowledge that it could all happen again tomorrow. The generator situation, Elijah said carefully. How often does equipment fail like this? Clara's laugh was bitter. More often than we'd like. The generator was installed in 1987. Most of our major systems are from the same era. We patch things up, make do, hope for the best. And when hope isn't enough, we have days like today. Elijah pulled out his phone, not to check messages for once, but to open his Notes app. What would it take to fix everything properly? What do you mean? I mean everything. New generator, updated electrical, modern equipment. What would it cost? Clara stared at him like he'd suggested they build a rocket ship. Are you serious? Dead serious. She was quiet for a long moment, clearly calculating. I mean, to do it right? New backup power system, updated medical equipment, renovated patient rooms. She shook her head. You're talking about millions of dollars. This isn't exactly a for-profit operation. We survive on Medicare reimbursements and whatever family members can contribute. But if money wasn't an obstacle? Money is always an obstacle. Humor me. Clara looked around the break room. At the ancient refrigerator held shut with tape, at the microwave with the broken door, at the motivational posters that had been there so long they'd become invisible. If money wasn't an obstacle, she said slowly, we'd replace every piece of equipment in this place. New beds that actually adjust properly. Bathrooms designed for people with mobility issues. A kitchen that doesn't break down twice a week. Physical therapy equipment that wasn't donated by a hospital that was throwing it away. Her voice was getting stronger as she warmed to the topic, and Elijah could see the passion that had drawn her to this work in the first place. We'd hire more staff, so nobody has to work 18-hour days when there's a crisis. We'd have activities coordinators and music therapists, and people whose only job is to sit with residents who don't get visitors. She paused, looking directly at him. We'd make this place feel less like somewhere people come to die and more like somewhere they come to live. Elijah made notes on his phone, calculating numbers that would have made most people dizzy. For him, they were manageable. More than manageable. What if I told you money wasn't an obstacle? Clara's expression shifted from exhaustion to suspicion. What are you talking about? I'm talking about fixing this place. All of it. You can't be serious. I'm always serious about investments. This isn't an investment, Clara said sharply. This is a nursing home. These are people's lives. Exactly. Something in his tone must have convinced her that he wasn't joking, because her expression changed again. Not to excitement. Clara Santos was too practical for that, but to cautious interest. Why? She asked. Why would you do that? It was a fair question. A week ago, Elijah couldn't have answered it. A week ago, he'd been a different person, someone who measured worth in stock prices and quarterly reports, who solved problems by writing checks and walking away. But sitting in that break room, still smelling like generator exhaust and human kindness, he found himself thinking about Harold's trust, about Mrs. Chin's gratitude, about the way Clara had worked tirelessly to make sure everyone was safe, asking nothing in return. Because someone should, he said finally. Because these people deserve better. Because you deserve better. Clara was quiet for a long time, turning her cold coffee cup in her hands like a worry stone. There would be conditions, she said finally, such as, this isn't charity. If you're going to do this, you do it right. You talk to the staff, the residents, the families. You find out what we actually need, not what you think we need. Elijah nodded. Agreed. And you don't disappear when the project gets boring or complicated or doesn't make you feel good about yourself anymore. The words stung because they were fair. How many times had he started something with good intentions, only to lose interest when the initial excitement wore off? I won't disappear, he said. Promise. He looked at her. This woman who'd accused him of assault, blackmailed him into volunteering, and somehow managed to show him parts of himself he'd forgotten existed. Clara Santos, who worked 18-hour days for people who might not remember her name tomorrow, who fought for dignity in a place that had forgotten what dignity looked like. I promise. As Elijah finally drove home that night, the city lights blurring past his windows, he realized something fundamental had changed. Not just in how he saw the nursing home, or his father, or even Clara. He was beginning to see himself differently. For the first time in years, Elijah Moore had a project that mattered. Not because it would make him richer or more powerful or more successful in the eyes of the world, but because it was right. The question was, would that be enough to sustain him when the real work began? 3 months later, Rose Hill Care Center was barely recognizable. The transformation had begun with the emergency power system, a state-of-the-art backup generator that could power the entire facility for weeks if necessary. But once Elijah started, he couldn't seem to stop. New patient beds replaced the mechanical relics from the 1980s. The kitchen got commercial-grade equipment that actually worked. Bathrooms were renovated with grab bars and roll-in showers and flooring that wouldn't become slippery death traps when wet. But the changes went deeper than infrastructure. Elijah had kept his promise to Clara. Instead of imposing his vision on the facility, he'd listened. To staff members who knew which wheelchairs broke down most often. To residents who missed having a garden where they could sit in the sun. To family members who wanted their loved ones to have dignity along with care. The project had consumed him in ways his business ventures never had. He found himself spending 12-hour days at the nursing home, not in boardrooms, but in hallways, learning the difference between what looked good on paper and what actually improved people's lives. It was harder than building an empire had ever been. Mr. Elijah, Mr. Elijah. The voice belonged to Mrs. Patterson, not the imaginary neighbor Harold sometimes asked about, but a real resident who'd been admitted 2 months earlier. She was 87, sharp as a tack, and had appointed herself the unofficial supervisor of all renovation work. The new exercise equipment arrived, she announced, practically vibrating with excitement. Physical therapy says I can try the recumbent bike tomorrow. Elijah smiled, noting how different Mrs. Patterson looked from the day she'd arrived. The new dining program, real meals prepared by actual chefs instead of institutional food service, had put color back in her cheeks. The upgraded lighting made everyone look more alive. Just remember to take it easy, he said. We don't need you setting any land speed records. She cackled with delight. At my age, every day above ground is a land speed record. He made his way through the facility, noting changes that had become routine but still amazed him. Residents sitting in the new garden, playing chess on tables that didn't wobble. Art therapy sessions in a room with actual natural light. A library corner where people could read books with large print and listen to audiobooks with wireless headphones that actually worked. But the biggest change was in the staff. More nurses meant shorter shifts and better patient care. New equipment meant less time fighting with machines and more time caring for people. Competitive salaries meant they could attract experienced professionals who chose to work here instead of settling for it. Clara had been promoted to director of nursing, a title that came with a substantial raise and the authority to implement changes she'd been advocating for years. She wore the responsibility well, though Elijah noticed she still worked longer hours than anyone else. He found her in the new activity room, watching a music therapy session. A young man with a guitar was leading a small group of residents in songs from the 1940s and 50s, music that reached past the fog of dementia to touch memories that medications couldn't access. Harold was there, swaying gently to In the Mood, with a smile that made him look 20 years younger. He's having a good day, Clara said softly, joining Elijah in the doorway. More good days lately. The music helps. Familiar rhythms, familiar melodies. Sometimes music can get through when nothing else can. They watched Harold attempt to snap his fingers to the beat. His coordination not quite what it used to be, but his enthusiasm undimmed. When the song ended, he applauded with genuine delight. You know what the best part is? Clara asked. What's that? He knows you now? Not as the paper boy or some character from his past. As Elijah. As his son. It was true. Somewhere in the past 3 months, as Elijah had become a fixture at the nursing home, Harold's confusion about his identity had cleared. Not completely. There were still days when the fog rolled in thick, but more often than not, Harold knew exactly who was sitting across from him. Mr. Elijah. Another voice called from behind them. You need to see this. Janet, one of the new activities coordinators, was practically bouncing with excitement. She led them to the computer room, a new addition that had initially been met with skepticism by staff who wondered if elderly residents would be interested in technology. The skeptics had been wrong. 3 residents were gathered around a laptop, video chatting with family members in different states. Mrs. Chun was showing her granddaughter in California the sweater she was knitting. Mr. Rodriguez was arguing good-naturedly with his son about baseball scores. And in the corner, Harold was waving at someone on the screen with the enthusiasm of a child. "That's my daughter-in-law," Harold explained to anyone who would listen. "Lives in Seattle. Haven't seen her in, well, too long." Elijah felt something catch in his throat. He'd arranged for the video call, reaching out to family members he'd never met to reconnect them with the father-in-law who'd been disappearing piece by piece. Harold's daughter-in-law had cried when she saw how good he looked, how happy he seemed. "This is incredible," she'd said through the screen. "He looks like himself again." That afternoon, Elijah sat with Harold in room 103, which had been renovated but kept the same number at Harold's request. The view from the window now included the expanded garden, where residents could watch birds and identify flowers and feel connected to seasons that still changed even when their internal worlds remained constant. "I've been thinking," Harold said, setting down the newspaper they'd been reading together. His voice was clear today, present in a way that had become more common but still felt like a gift. "About what?" "About what happens next." Elijah looked up from the comics section. "What do you mean?" Harold was quiet for a moment, gathering thoughts that required more effort than they once had. "This place is beautiful now. The people who work here are happy. The residents are treated well." He paused. "But what happens to you?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've spent 3 months fixing this place, but you can't spend your whole life here. You have a business to run, a life to live." It was a fair question, and one Elijah had been avoiding. His assistant had been fielding calls and managing crises, but several major decisions were waiting for his attention. Board meetings had been postponed. Investment opportunities had been declined. His carefully constructed empire was running on autopilot while he learned the difference between high-thread count sheets and industrial linens. "I don't know," he said honestly. Harold smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he understood more than his disease usually allowed. "You know what I think?" "What's that?" "I think you've been trying to fix this place, but really you've been fixing yourself." The words hit with unexpected force. Elijah looked around room 103 at the comfortable furniture and good lighting and family photos he'd helped Harold organize. At the man his father had become when given the chance to be more than his illness. "Maybe," he said. "Definitely." Harold's voice was firm, carrying a certainty that reminded Elijah of the businessman his father had once been. "Question is, what are you going to do with what you've learned?" Before Elijah could answer, Clara appeared in the doorway. She looked different than she had 3 months ago, less tired, less defensive, more like someone who'd found hope in an unlikely place. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but there's someone here to see you." "Business or personal?" "Both, I think." She led him to the main lobby, where a woman in an expensive suit was waiting with the kind of impatience that suggested she was used to having her time considered valuable. Elijah recognized her immediately, Sarah Matthews, the reporter who'd been trying to get an interview with him for months. "Mr. Moore," she said, extending a manicured hand. "I was hoping we could talk. About this." She gestured around the transformed lobby with its comfortable seating and natural light and artwork created by residents in the new art therapy program. "Word is getting out about what you've done here. People are curious." Elijah glanced back toward room 103, where Harold was probably still reading the comics and finding them just as funny as he had an hour ago. "It's not a story," he said. "Everything's a story, Mr. Moore. The question is who gets to tell it." She had a point. In a few hours, his transformation of Rosehill Care Center would either be portrayed as a publicity stunt by a guilty millionaire or as something more genuine. The narrative would be written with or without his cooperation. "Give me a minute," he said. He walked back toward room 103, past residents who waved at him like family, past staff members who no longer saw him as an outsider with more money than sense, past the life he'd accidentally built while trying to fix someone else's. Harold was exactly where he'd left him, humming along to music only he could hear. "Dad," Elijah said, settling back into his chair. "I might need to make some changes." "What kind of changes?" "The kind that mean I can't be here every day anymore." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "You know what the difference is between a good businessman and a great one?" "What's that?" "A good businessman builds something that makes money. A great one builds something that makes a difference." Harold's eyes were clear, focused, completely present. Question is, which one do you want to be? Elijah looked at his father, really looked at him. The man who'd been absent for most of his childhood but was fully present now. Who'd forgotten 1,000 details but remembered what mattered. I want to be both, Elijah said. Harold smiled. Then you'd better get started. As Elijah walked back toward the lobby, toward the reporter who would tell his story to the world, he realized something had fundamentally changed. 3 months ago, he'd been a millionaire who could buy anything except peace. Now he was something else entirely. He was someone who'd learned the difference between success and significance. The question was, what was he going to do with that knowledge? The interview took place in the garden. Sarah Matthews had initially suggested the main lobby, better lighting, she'd said, more professional backdrop. But Elijah had insisted on the garden, where residents could continue their afternoon routines and the conversation could happen in the context of what actually mattered. So, Sarah began. Her recorder placed carefully between them on the weathered wooden table that Harold had helped choose from a catalog 3 weeks earlier. Let's start at the beginning. What brought you to Rosehill Care Center? Elijah watched Mrs. Patterson tend to the roses she'd planted in raised beds designed for wheelchairs. Mr. Kim was feeding birds from a bench positioned to catch the afternoon sun. Normal people living normal lives in a place that had finally learned to honor normal lives. My father, he said simply. Harold Moore. He's been a resident here for about a year. Alzheimer's. Sarah made a note. And the incident that started all this, when you were accused of pushing him. Elijah almost smiled. The incident. 3 months ago, it had seemed like the end of the world. Now it felt like the beginning of something he couldn't have imagined. I wasn't accused, he said carefully. I was misunderstood. By Nurse Santos? By Clara, yes. Tell me about that day. Elijah looked across the garden to where Clara was helping a resident navigate the walking path with a new walker. Her hair was pulled back in its usual ponytail, but she looked different now. Lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. My father fell, Elijah said. I tried to catch him, but wasn't fast enough. Clara saw what looked like a man standing over an elderly patient who'd just hit the floor. She made a reasonable assumption, but it was wrong. Yes. And she threatened to file a report unless you apologized. Elijah remembered that moment. The fury he'd felt at being accused of something he hadn't done, the panic at the thought of scandal touching his carefully constructed reputation. Now it seemed like it had happened to someone else. She gave me a choice, he said. I could make things right, or I could make things worse. So you chose to apologize for something you didn't do? I chose to come back. Sarah frowned, clearly not getting the distinction she was looking for. And that led to all this. She gestured around the garden, at the facility that looked nothing like the tired nursing home it had been 3 months earlier. That led to understanding. Understanding what? Elijah was quiet for a moment, trying to find words for something that had taken months to comprehend. In the distance, he could hear Harold laughing at something one of the other residents had said. The sound was clear and genuine and completely present. Understanding that I'd been living the wrong life, he said finally. Sarah leaned forward, sensing the heart of the story. What do you mean by that? I mean, I'd spent 43 years believing that success was about accumulation. Money, power, possessions, achievements. The more you had, the more successful you were. He paused. But success isn't about what you accumulate. It's about what you contribute. And you learned that here? I learned that from the people here. From watching Clara work 18-hour days for people who might not remember her name the next morning. From seeing how happy Harold gets when someone sits with him to read the comics. From understanding that the most important work isn't always the most profitable work. Sarah made notes, but Elijah could tell she was still looking for a different angle. Something more dramatic, more traditionally newsworthy. The transformation of this facility, she said. Word is you've invested several $1,000,000 here. Some people might see that as guilt money, attempting to buy your way out of an uncomfortable situation. Some people would be wrong. Then what was it? Elijah looked around the garden again, at residents who'd found dignity in a place that had forgotten what dignity looked like. At staff members who could finally do their jobs properly instead of fighting with broken equipment and impossible caseloads. At his father, who was teaching another resident how to fold newspaper boats with hands that shook but a smile that was steady. It was an investment, he said. The first real investment I'd made in my life. In what sense? In the sense that I finally invested in something that would make the world better instead of just making me richer. Sarah looked up from her notes. That's quite a transformation for someone known for hostile takeovers and aggressive business practices. It was true. Elijah Moore's reputation had been built on efficiency and ruthlessness, on an ability to see through emotional appeals to the bottom line that really mattered. He'd been profiled in business magazines as someone who could make the hard decisions other executives couldn't stomach. People change, he said. Do they? Or do they just find better public relations? The question was fair, but felt like a challenge. Sarah Matthews had made a career out of finding the truth behind carefully constructed facades. She wasn't going to be satisfied with platitudes about personal growth and charitable giving. You want to know if this is real? Elijah asked. I want to know what really happened here. Elijah stood up from the table, gesturing for her to follow him. They walked through the facility slowly, past the renovated rooms and upgraded equipment and cheerful staff members who no longer looked like they were running on fumes and determination alone. But they also walked past room 103, where Harold was napping in a chair that had been adjusted to support his increasingly fragile frame. Past the medication room, where precise dosages were dispensed by nurses who had time to double-check their work. Past the physical therapy room, where residents worked with equipment that helped instead of hindered their progress. What really happened here, Elijah said as they completed the circuit, is that I discovered I'd been asking the wrong questions my entire life. What do you mean? I'd been asking, how can I get more? Instead of how can I give more? I'd been asking, how can I win? Instead of how can I help? I'd been asking, what's in it for me? Instead of what can I do that matters? They'd returned to the garden, where the afternoon light was beginning to slant through the trees Harold had helped select from a nursery catalog. The residents were starting to move inside for dinner. Real dinner, prepared by chefs who understood that food could be medicine for the soul as well as the body. The incident with your father, Sarah said, settling back at the table. Clara Santos has admitted that she knew fairly quickly that you hadn't pushed him. Security cameras confirmed it. But she continued to, shall we say, encourage your involvement here. How do you feel about that? Elijah smiled, the first completely genuine smile he'd given during the interview. I feel grateful. Grateful? She essentially blackmailed you into community service. She saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, which was the capacity to be better than I was. Sarah made a note, but her expression suggested she was still struggling to understand the dynamic. And now, you and Nurse Santos, Director Santos. The question had undertones that Elijah recognized, but didn't feel like addressing directly. His relationship with Clara had evolved over the months, but not in the way gossip magazines might hope. It was something deeper than romance and more complex than friendship. Clara and I are partners, he said carefully, in making sure this place continues to serve the people who need it. Just partners? Partners in something that matters more than either of us individually. As if summoned by the conversation, Clara appeared at the edge of the garden. She'd changed out of her scrubs into jeans and a sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way that made her look younger and somehow more vulnerable. Sorry to interrupt, she said, but Harold's asking for you. He wants to show you something. Elijah stood, then paused. Would you like to meet him? He asked Sarah. My father, if that's appropriate. Room 103 was warm with late afternoon light. Harold was sitting at his small table, carefully arranging something that looked like a newspaper airplane but was actually more complex. A boat with sails and a cabin and details that suggested hours of careful work. Look what I made, Harold announced with the pride of a child showing off a school project. It's for the fountain in the garden. Clara said we could sail it tomorrow if the weather's nice. Elijah picked up the boat carefully, noting the precision of the folds, the way Harold had used colored sections from different parts of the newspaper to create decorative patterns. It's beautiful, Dad. I remember how to make them, Harold said, his voice carrying wonder at the persistence of this particular skill. I can't remember what I had for breakfast, but I remember how to fold newspaper boats. Memory is mysterious, Sarah observed quietly. Harold looked at her with the polite interest he showed all strangers. Are you a friend of my son's? I'm a reporter. I'm writing a story about what he's done here. Harold nodded thoughtfully. He's a good boy. Always was, even when he was too busy to show it. Too busy. Work, Harold said with a dismissive wave. Always working. Making money, building companies, achieving things. He looked at Elijah with eyes that were completely clear, completely present. But money isn't really wealth, is it? Wealth is having people who care about you. Wealth is being useful. Wealth is knowing that your life made other lives better. Sarah looked between father and son, perhaps sensing something that couldn't be captured in quotes or sound bites. And now, she asked, is your son wealthy now? Harold smiled, reaching over to squeeze Elijah's hand with fingers that were thin but warm. Now he's the richest man I know. Later that evening, after Sarah had left and the residents had finished dinner and settled into their evening routines, Elijah found himself in the garden with Clara. They sat on the bench Harold had chosen, watching the fountain he'd insisted be installed because moving water sounds like life. How do you think the interview went? Clara asked. Honestly, I don't care. She looked at him with surprise. 3 months ago, you would have cared. 3 months ago, I was a different person. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the fountain and the distant sound of residents preparing for bed. Somewhere inside, Harold was probably arranging his newspaper boats on the windowsill, planning tomorrow's sailing expedition. Can I tell you something? Clara said eventually. Of course. I knew. Knew what? That first day, when your father fell. I knew you hadn't pushed him. The cameras showed it clearly. You were trying to catch him, not hurt him. Elijah turned to look at her fully. Then why? Because you had the look of a man who needed to learn something important. And because I thought maybe, if you spent enough time here, you might figure out what that was. You manipulated me. I gave you an opportunity. There's a difference. Elijah considered this, thinking about all the moments over the past 3 months when he could have walked away. When he could have sent lawyers or written checks or solved the problem in ways that didn't require his personal involvement. What if I hadn't taken it? The opportunity. Clara shrugged. Then you would have missed out on becoming the person you were supposed to be. And what person is that? She smiled, the kind of smile that suggested she'd been waiting for him to ask that question. The person who understands that real wealth isn't what you accumulate. It's what you contribute. The person who knows that success isn't about winning. It's about making sure other people don't lose. The person who's learned that the most important investments aren't in stocks or bonds or real estate. What are they in? People. Relationships. The kind of legacy that outlasts bank accounts. As they sat in the garden Harold had helped design, surrounded by the life they'd all built together, Elijah realized something fundamental had changed. Not just in how he saw the world, but in how he saw himself. 3 months ago, he'd been a millionaire who could buy anything except peace. Tonight, he was something richer, a son who'd learned to love his father, a man who'd discovered his purpose, a person who'd finally understood the difference between success and significance. The transformation wasn't complete, might never be complete, but it was real. And for the first time in his adult life, that felt like enough. Because sometimes the most valuable things in life can't be bought. They can only be earned. One newspaper boat at a time. If you made it to the end, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. See you in the next one.